June 21, 1943. A humid summer evening descended over the dense pine forests near Bryansk, western Russia. As mosquitoes swarmed in the twilight air, Samuel Johnson, an African-American engineer from Detroit, attached to the Office of Strategic Services, crawled through the undergrowth toward the Moscow-Warsaw railway line. What he believed would be a simple reconnaissance mission would ultimately change the course of the Eastern Front. The German supply officers confidently scheduled 40 armored train transports over the coming month, certain their anti-partisan measures had made the rail lines impenetrable. They could not have been more wrong. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how one man's ingenious invention, a simple metal shim barely larger than a playing card, would transform the mechanics of resistance on the Eastern Front and reveal how technical ingenuity could overcome seemingly insurmountable military superiority. Samuel Johnson had not planned to be in the forests of Russia in the summer of 1943. Before the war, he had been an automotive engineer at one of Detroit's major manufacturing plants, specializing in suspension systems. His expertise had made him invaluable to the war effort, first working on tank designs in American factories. But his knowledge would prove even more valuable in the field. "I never imagined I'd end up here," Johnson wrote in his field journal that evening. 3 years ago, I was designing automobile parts, worrying about consumer comfort. Now I'm designing parts to stop armored trains while worrying about survival." Johnson had arrived in Russia 4 months earlier as part of a special technical advisory team. The American government had sent him to work with Soviet and local partisan forces, bringing American engineering expertise to the resistance efforts. What made Johnson especially valuable was his unique combination of engineering knowledge and practical experience. Colonel Dmitry Volkov, commander of the Partisan unit operating in the Bryansk region, initially had reservations. "When they told me they were sending an American engineer, I expected someone who knew only theory," Volkov later recounted in his post-war memoirs. But Johnson understood materials, stress points, and most importantly, how to work with limited resources. The German transport network represented the lifeblood of their Eastern Front operations. Each month, hundreds of trains carried essential supplies, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and personnel to the forward units. The railways were heavily guarded, with regular patrols, fortified stations, and aerial surveillance. The Germans have electrified fencing at critical junctions, motion detectors on major bridges, and roving patrols with dogs, reported Lieutenant Natalia Petrova, the Partisan unit's intelligence officer. Traditional derailment tactics have become nearly impossible. They've learned to spot explosive charges, and they execute 50 locals for every successful attack. It was these circumstances that led to the evening of June 21st, when Johnson found himself lying in the damp forest soil, observing a section of track 2 miles east of the Bryansk junction. "The security looks exactly as Petrova described," Johnson noted in his journal. "Guards pass at 12-minute intervals. They have floodlights on the curves, and the dog patrols cover the straightaways. But I noticed something interesting about the track construction itself. There's a vulnerability in the rail connection plates. The standard railway track consists of sections joined together by connection plates and bolts. Under normal circumstances, these connections were solid and reliable. But Johnson recognized that the extreme weather conditions of Western Russia, blistering summers and freezing winters, combined with the heavy loads of military transport, created unique stress patterns. "The temperature today reached 86 degrees Fahrenheit, Johnson recorded. "The rails expand in this heat, then contract dramatically during cool nights. I observed a 0.7 millimeter gap at the connection points during peak afternoon temperatures, but by evening, as the metal cooled, the gap closed completely." This observation became the foundation for what would become known as the Johnson Shim, a precisely calibrated metal device that could be covertly installed between rail sections. Unlike explosive devices, these shims were virtually undetectable by visual inspection. Back at the Partisan camp, a collection of well-camouflaged dugouts and lean-tos deep in the Bryansk forest, Johnson sketched his idea for Colonel Volkov and the unit's senior officers. "The principle is simple," Johnson explained. We create a thin, hardened steel shim that can be slipped into the connection joint. It's too thin to notice during inspections, but strong enough to create a critical gap when a heavy load passes over. Lieutenant Petrova looked skeptical. The Germans check the tracks before each important transport. They use mirror carts to inspect the underside. How will these shims remain undetected? Johnson smiled. That's where the design becomes clever. The shim remains completely flush until pressure is applied from above. Only when a fully loaded train passes over does it create the gap that forces the rail to separate. Major Ivan Sokolov, the unit's operations officer, leaned forward with interest. And how do we manufacture these devices? We have limited machinery and almost no access to proper metals. This question highlighted one of the Partisan unit's greatest challenges. Operating behind enemy lines, they could not simply order parts or use factory equipment. Everything had to be improvised or scavenged. Johnson had anticipated this problem. I've designed it to be manufactured from the armor plating of disabled German tanks. We can salvage the metal from the vehicles your unit has already neutralized. This proposal represented a powerful irony that was not lost on the Russian officers, using the Germans' own tanks to disable their supply trains. The next 3 weeks were dedicated to testing and manufacturing the first batch of Johnson's shims. Working in a makeshift forge hidden beneath the dense forest canopy, Johnson collaborated with Pavel Orlov, a former metallurgist from Minsk, who had joined the Partisans after his entire family perished during the German occupation. Johnson's design is brilliant in its simplicity, Orlov noted in the Partisan operation log. We're using high-carbon steel from the underside of a disabled German tank. The composition is perfect, flexible enough to withstand initial pressure, but rigid enough to create the critical gap under sustained weight. The manufacturing process required precision, despite their primitive conditions. Each shim needed to be exactly 4.6 millimeters thick, with beveled edges that would slide perfectly into the rail joints. Orlov and Johnson worked day and night, heating the salvaged metal in a charcoal forge and hammering it into the required dimensions. By mid-July, they had produced 18 shims. The next challenge was testing the device without alerting German forces to their plan. We cannot risk a test on the actual railway, Colonel Volkov insisted during the planning meeting. If it fails, the Germans will discover the device and adapt their inspections. Johnson proposed an alternative. We can build a test section that replicates the exact specifications of the Moscow-Warsaw line. If we use the same rail weight and connection system, we can verify the effectiveness. Using rails salvaged from an abandoned mining operation, the Partisans constructed a 12-meter test track deep in the forest. They mounted the rails on concrete sleepers and replicated the exact specifications of the main line. To simulate the weight of a fully loaded train, they built a weighted sled that could be pulled over the test section by the Partisan unit's 3 horses. The initial tests were disappointing. Test number 1. Shim installed at junction point. Applied pressure equivalent to approximately 15 tons. Result: no separation. Read the test log from July 18th. Similar results followed for the next 6 attempts. The problem is the pressure distribution, Johnson concluded after reviewing the failed tests. On a real train, the pressure comes from multiple carriages in succession, creating a wave-like force that builds with each passing axle. Our test setup can't replicate that. Johnson and Orlov returned to their design, making crucial adjustments. The revised shim included a slightly raised center section that would create an initial instability in the rail joint. This modification meant that each subsequent train car would exert progressively more force on the already compromised connection. The next round of testing showed more promising results. By the 8th test, they achieved partial separation of the rail joint. By the 12th test, they had consistent success. Final design approved, noted Johnson on July 27th. Shim thickness, 4.75 millimeters. Material: hardened tank armor plate double tempered. Installation depth, 3.2 centimeters into the rail joint. Estimated effectiveness: separation after passage of 3rd to 5th rail car, depending on weight. With the design finalized, the Partisan unit prepared for deployment. Colonel Volkov assembled the team that would install the shims on the actual railway line. The operation would require extraordinary precision and timing. "We have intelligence that a major transport of armored vehicles is scheduled for the night of August 2nd, Lieutenant Petrova informed the group. The transport includes 26 railcars carrying light tanks, armored personnel carriers, fuel and ammunition. It's bound for the Kursk sector, where German forces are preparing a major offensive." The upcoming German operation at Kursk was a closely guarded secret, but Soviet intelligence had gathered enough information to understand its significance. The German High Command was planning a massive offensive involving thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, an operation that would require extensive railway transport to position the necessary forces and supplies. "If we can disrupt their supply chain now, we can significantly impact their offensive capabilities," Volkov told his officers. "Johnson's Shims give us an opportunity to do this without alerting them to our methods." The installation team consisted of 4 individuals: Johnson himself, Lieutenant Petrova, Sergeant Alexei Baranov, a former railway worker who knew the tracks intimately, and Nikolai Zollner, a 19-year-old local who had joined the Partisans after his village was destroyed. The team began their approach to the railway line shortly after midnight on August 2nd. They moved silently through the forest, avoiding the established patrol routes that Petrova's intelligence had mapped out. The night was cloudy with light rain, ideal conditions, Johnson later wrote. "The rainfall muffled our movements and reduced visibility for the guards. We reached our target section, approximately 1 kilometer east of Checkpoint 3, where the track curves slightly as it enters a small cutting through a hillside. This location had been carefully selected. The curve would force the train to reduce speed slightly, the cutting would contain any derailed cars, and the distance from the nearest guard post would allow the team sufficient time to retreat before any response could be organized." Sergeant Baranov led the actual installation. His experience with railway maintenance made him the most qualified to ensure proper placement. "We have 12 minutes until the next patrol," Petrova whispered as they reached the tracks. "Work fast but precisely." Baranov and Johnson laid on their stomachs beside the rails, working by touch more than sight. Using a specialized tool Johnson had designed, essentially a modified tire iron with a flattened end, they carefully inserted the first shim into the rail joint. "It slid in perfectly," Johnson recalled. "We could feel it lock into place, completely invisible to visual inspection." They proceeded to install 3 more shims at calculated intervals along a 60-meter section of track. Each installation took approximately 2 minutes, requiring careful manipulation to ensure the device seated properly without visible evidence. "Installation complete," Baranov confirmed at last. 4 shims in place, all secure." The team retreated into the forest just as the faint beam of a flashlight appeared in the distance, the approaching patrol. They watched from concealment as 2 German soldiers walked the length of the track, sweeping their lights across the rails and connections. "They passed right over our work without the slightest hesitation," Johnson noted with satisfaction. The shims were completely invisible to their inspection. With the devices successfully installed, the team made their way back to the Partisan camp. Now came the waiting. According to the intelligence reports, the armored transport would pass their section sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning. At the camp, Colonel Volkov had established an observation post on a hilltop with a clear view of the railway line. Equipped with binoculars, the observers would report the results of the operation. 2:55 in the morning. "No activity on the line," came the first radio transmission. 3:20, still clear. At 3:42, the report changed. "Train approaching from the east. Heavy transport. Estimated 20-plus cars. Moving at reduced speed due to the load." The Partisan camp fell silent as everyone waited for the next transmission. Johnson found himself holding his breath, mentally calculating the physics of what was about to occur. Had they accounted for all variables? Would the shims perform as designed? 3:45, train passing target section now, normal operation. "Wait!" The radio fell silent for several seconds. "Confirmation. Derailment in progress. Multiple cars affected. The track has separated exactly as planned. Massive disruption to the transport." A cheer erupted through the Partisan camp. Johnson felt a complex mix of emotions. Professional satisfaction at the success of his design, combined with the sobering awareness of its implications. The observation team continued their reports. The locomotive and first two cars passed safely. Derailment began with the third car, an armored personnel carrier transport. Subsequent cars have left the track. Complete blockage of the line. German response units are mobilizing from checkpoint 3, but the damage is extensive. Colonel Volkov turned to Johnson, extending his hand. "Congratulations, Engineer Johnson. Your device worked perfectly." What none of them fully appreciated in that moment was how truly revolutionary this approach would prove to be. Unlike conventional partisan tactics that relied on explosives or direct sabotage, the Johnson Shim was virtually undetectable, both before and after the incident. The Germans will likely attribute this to track fatigue or connection failure, Johnson predicted during the debriefing session the following day. There will be no evidence of explosive residue, no obvious sabotage, just a seemingly natural failure under the stress of an overloaded transport. This prediction proved accurate. German investigation teams spent 2 days examining the derailment site. Their reports, later captured by advancing Soviet forces, concluded that the incident resulted from structural failure due to excessive load stress combined with thermal expansion. The success of this first operation led to rapid expansion of what the partisans now called Operation Shim. Over the next 3 weeks, the manufacturing team produced an additional 72 devices. Installation teams, now trained in Johnson's techniques, deployed them across strategic sections of the German supply network. By late August, reports indicated that 7 additional transports had been derailed using the same method. German logistics officers were baffled by the sudden series of track failures. They responded by reducing load weights and imposing stricter inspection protocols, measures that further reduced their transport efficiency but failed to detect the actual cause. The beauty of Johnson's method is its psychological impact, Colonel Volkov noted in his report to the Soviet High Command. The Germans now distrust their own railway system. They're reducing loads, slowing transports, and conducting time-consuming inspections that delay critical supplies. The effect goes far beyond the actual derailments. Indeed, by September, German transport efficiency on the Eastern Front had declined by an estimated 22%. Engineering teams were diverted from other projects to reinforce railway connections throughout the region. A massive allocation of resources that yielded no improvement since they were addressing the wrong problem. For Samuel Johnson, the success brought mixed emotions. His engineering mind took professional pride in the elegant solution he had created, yet he remained acutely aware of the human consequences involved in this form of resistance. "I designed automobile suspensions to make rides more comfortable," he wrote in his journal. "Now I'm designing devices that do the opposite, creating disruption and discomfort on a massive scale." Engineering has always been about solving problems, but war changes the nature of the problems we solve. As summer turned to autumn, the impact of the Johnson Shim continued to grow. German forces preparing for their massive offensive at Kursk found their supply chains increasingly unreliable. Schedules slipped, equipment deliveries fell behind, and confidence in the railway system, the backbone of their logistics, eroded steadily. Lieutenant Petrova's intelligence network reported increasing frustration among German command staff. "They're blaming each other," she informed Colonel Volkov during a September briefing. "Transport officers blame the engineers for poor track maintenance. Engineers blame the quartermaster for overloaded trains. The quartermaster blames factory production for shipping substandard equipment. No one suspects the actual cause." This confusion represented a significant victory in itself. The German military machine, renowned for its efficiency and coordination, was now experiencing internal friction and blame shifting, further reducing their operational effectiveness. By October, the Partisan unit had expanded their operation to include 3 separate manufacturing facilities hidden throughout the Bryansk forest. Production reached approximately 30 shims per week, allowing for deployment across an ever-widening area of operations. Samuel Johnson continued refining the design, creating variations adapted to different track configurations and seasonal conditions. As autumn brought cooler temperatures, the thermal properties of the rails changed. requiring adjustments to the Shim specifications. Winter version completed, Johnson recorded on October 12th. Thickness increased to 5.2 millimeters to account for cold weather contraction of the rails. Testing confirms effectiveness down to -20 degrees Celsius. The success of the Johnson Shim soon attracted attention from the highest levels of Allied command. In late October, a coded message arrived from OSS headquarters in London. Johnson device exceeding all expectations. Stop requesting complete documentation for deployment. In other theaters, stop congratulations on extraordinary success. Stop. Samuel Johnson spent 3 days preparing detailed schematics and manufacturing instructions. These documents were photographed using microfilm and transported out through the Partisan network, eventually reaching London, where they would influence resistance operations throughout occupied Europe. As the first snow dusted the Bryansk forest in early November, Johnson and Colonel Volkov assessed the impact of their operation. Intelligence estimates suggested that between the initial deployment in August and the end of October, the Johnson Shim had been responsible for disrupting 40 separate German transports, most carrying armored vehicles and supplies bound for frontline units. The numbers tell a remarkable story, Volkov observed. German transport capacity reduced by 35%, delivery times increased by an average of 16 days, maintenance resources diverted from other critical infrastructure, and all accomplished without a single partisan casualty. This last point was perhaps the most significant. Traditional derailment operations typically resulted in fierce German reprisals against local populations. Villages near sabotage sites often faced collective punishment, executions, deportations, or complete destruction. The Johnson Shim, by contrast, appeared to be a natural mechanical failure, triggering no such reprisals. "We've changed the equation," Johnson reflected, as he sat beside the campfire on a cold November evening. "For the first time, resistance can be truly invisible. The oppressor cannot punish what they cannot detect." Around that same campfire, the members of the partisan unit shared stories and reflected on their unusual collaboration. Russian partisans, a black American engineer, local villagers and former industrial workers had combined their diverse knowledge to create something none could have achieved alone. "In Detroit, I faced discrimination despite my education and skills," Johnson told his companions. "Here, in the middle of a war zone, I found respect based solely on what I could contribute. There's a lesson in that, I think." Nikolai Zollner, the young local who had helped install the first Shims, nodded thoughtfully. "Before you came, we thought resistance meant only guns and explosives. You showed us that the mind can be an equally powerful weapon." As 1943 drew to a close, the legacy of Samuel Johnson's invention was still unfolding. The simple metal device, no larger than a playing card, manufactured from repurposed enemy armor, had demonstrated how ingenuity could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. German engineering, for all its precision and resources, had been confounded by a simple, elegant solution devised in a forest workshop with minimal tools. The mighty railway network that supported the entire Eastern Front had been compromised not by brute force, but by applied knowledge and careful observation. In his final journal entry of the year, dated December 31st, 1943, Samuel Johnson wrote words that would later be inscribed on a memorial in the Bryansk forest. "The greatest resistance often comes not from grand gestures or dramatic actions, but from understanding the fundamental principles that govern all systems. Find the small point where pressure can be applied, and even the mightiest machine can be brought to a halt." As the new year arrived, bringing with it the promise of continued struggle, but also the growing possibility of eventual victory, Johnson and the partisan unit prepared for the next phase of their operation. The success of the Johnson Shim had proven that innovation, applied with precision and patience, could change the course of warfare itself. January 5th, 1944. The temperature had plunged to 27 degrees below zero, transforming the Bryansk forest into a crystalline landscape of white and silver. Samuel Johnson stood with Colonel Volkov at the edge of the frozen Desna River, watching as partisan laborers dragged sleds loaded with salvaged tank armor across the ice. "The cold actually helps our operation," Johnson observed. his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. German patrols stay closer to their warming stations, and their inspections become rushed and superficial. Volkov nodded, pulling his fur-lined coat tighter. But it also creates new challenges for us. The metal becomes brittle in these temperatures. Your manufacturing process needs adjustment. The colonel was right. The harsh Russian winter had introduced new variables to the Johnson-Shim operation. The extreme cold affected not only the properties of the railway tracks, but also the manufacturing process for the shims themselves. Johnson had spent the previous week modifying the tempering process to accommodate the winter conditions. "We've adjusted our methods," he assured Volkov. "The new winter-grade shims are actually stronger. The cold makes the German steel more susceptible to stress fractures when properly exploited." This ongoing refinement of the Johnson Shim reflected the engineers' methodical approach to resistance. While many partisan activities relied on courage and sacrifice, Johnson's contribution demonstrated how technical expertise could be equally valuable to the war effort. As they returned to the main partisan camp, Johnson reviewed the intelligence reports that had arrived overnight. Lieutenant Petrova had established an impressive network of informants throughout the region, including several Ukrainian laborers forced to work on railway maintenance crews. "According to our sources," Johnson told Volkov as they warmed themselves by the camp's central fire, "the Germans are planning to move a significant armored transport through Sector 4 next week. At least 30 rail cars carrying tanks, artillery, and ammunition. They're reinforcing their positions around Gomel in anticipation of a Soviet advance." Volkov studied the hand-drawn map where Johnson had marked the transport route. "This represents an opportunity, but also increased risk. They'll have heightened security for such a valuable shipment." Johnson pointed to a section of the rail line that passed through a narrow valley approximately 20 kilometers west of their position. This location offers several advantages. The topography forces the train to reduce speed. The surrounding terrain provides excellent concealment for our installation team, and most importantly, the temperature fluctuations in the valley are more extreme than the surrounding areas. "Explain," Volkov prompted. "The valley creates what engineers call a temperature inversion layer," Johnson continued. "During winter days, cold air gets trapped at the bottom of the valley, while slightly warmer air sits above it. But at night, this pattern reverses dramatically. The temperature differential creates additional stress on the metal structures, including the railway tracks." This level of environmental analysis had become characteristic of Johnson's approach. Rather than fighting against natural forces, he had learned to identify how they could be leveraged to amplify the effectiveness of resistance efforts. The planning for this operation, dubbed Frost Valley by the Partisan Command, continued over the next 3 days. Unlike previous deployments that used standard shims, this operation would utilize the new winter-grade devices specifically calibrated to exploit the unique conditions of the valley location. Pavel Orlov, who had continued to refine the manufacturing process, presented the first batch of winter-grade shims to the command team on January 8th. "We've modified both the thickness and the material composition," Orlov explained, holding up one of the devices. "The standard shim was 4.75 millimeters thick. These winter variants are 5.4 millimeters. Additionally, we've added carbon content by incorporating powdered coal during the tempering process, increasing both hardness and brittleness." Johnson examined one of the new shims closely. "Excellent work. The increased thickness accommodates the cold weather contraction of the rails, while the modified composition ensures the shim itself remains rigid under pressure." The installation team for Operation Frost Valley would consist of 4 experienced operatives. Sergeant Baranov would again lead the technical aspects, assisted by Nikolai Zollner. Lieutenant Petrova would handle security and communications, while a new addition, Maria Kordzeva, a former surveyor who knew the valley terrain intimately, would guide the team through the complex approach route. Johnson, though deeply involved in the planning, would not accompany this mission. His value as the designer and technical director of the overall operation meant that Colonel Volkov had designated him as essential personnel, not to be risked on field deployments. "I understand the logic," Johnson wrote in his journal that evening, "but I feel a certain responsibility to be there. These are my designs, my calculations. If something goes wrong, I should be present to address it. Despite his concerns, the operation proceeded according to plan. The installation team departed the Partisan camp at 2200 hours on January 10th, traveling by night through the snow-covered forest. Their journey would take approximately 6 hours, allowing them to reach the target location well before the expected transport. Back at the camp, Johnson waited with Colonel Volkov and the other staff officers. A radio operator maintained contact with Lieutenant Petrova, who would send coded updates at predetermined intervals. "Team has reached checkpoint 1, came the first transmission at midnight. Weather conditions as expected. Proceeding on schedule. Checkpoint 2 reached, followed at 1:30 in the morning. Patrols observed at expected frequency. No complications." At 3:15, the most critical update arrived. Target location reached. Beginning installation. Temperature -31 degrees Celsius. Rail conditions optimal. Johnson checked his watch repeatedly during the next 45 minutes. The estimated time required to install 6 winter-grade shims at the predetermined intervals. When the radio finally crackled again at 4:02, he felt himself exhale. Installation complete. All devices in position. Team withdrawing along secondary route. Expected return 0800. The German armored transport was scheduled to pass through the valley sector at approximately 0600, just as dawn would be breaking. This timing was deliberate on the German part, allowing them to move significant forces during darkness while having daylight for any potential response to problems. What they could not have anticipated was how this timing would interact with the temperature inversion Johnson had identified. The valley would experience its most extreme temperature drop precisely as the transport entered the sector. "If our calculations are correct," Johnson explained to the assembled officers, "the rails will contract by an additional 0.8 millimeters during that hour. Combined with the pressure from the armored vehicles, the effect on our shims should be dramatic." The Partisan camp maintained radio silence during the critical period. Any transmission might be detected by German direction-finding equipment, potentially compromising the operation. Instead, they had positioned observers on the high ground overlooking the valley, equipped with signal flares to indicate success. At 6:27 that morning, a bright red flare illuminated the northern sky. "Confirmation," announced Colonel Volkov. "Operation Frost Valley has succeeded." The full details would not become clear until the installation team returned to camp and Lieutenant Petrova delivered her report. When she did, the results exceeded even Johnson's calculations. "Catastrophic derailment," Petrova reported to the assembled command staff. The locomotive and first 2 cars passed safely as designed. The third car, a flat transport carrying a heavy tank, triggered the first shim. The derailment began precisely at the calculated point, but propagated more extensively than predicted. According to Petrova's observations, the extreme cold had amplified the effectiveness of the shims. As the tank transport derailed, it pulled subsequent cars off the track more dramatically than in previous operations. Additionally, the temperature-weakened steel of the rails themselves had shattered rather than merely separating at the joints. "The damage is far more extensive than our previous operations," Petrova continued. "Our sources indicate repair crews estimate at least 2 weeks to restore the line. More significantly, the Germans appear genuinely baffled. Their engineering teams are focusing entirely on metal fatigue caused by cold, exactly as we intended." This outcome represented more than a tactical success. It demonstrated a strategic evolution in the partisan approach to resistance. Rather than direct confrontation or obvious sabotage, Johnson's method had turned the Germans' own engineering assumptions against them. "They're looking for a problem that doesn't exist," Johnson explained when Colonel Volkov asked him to elaborate. "They'll waste resources strengthening rails against cold weather fatigue when the actual cause, our shims, remains undetected. Each solution they implement will be addressing the wrong problem." This psychological dimension became increasingly important as January progressed. German engineering units diverted significant resources to winterizing the railway network, replacing hundreds of kilometers of track and connection joints. These efforts consumed valuable materials and labor, while failing to address the actual cause of the derailments. By the end of January, the Johnson-Shim operation had expanded to cover 3 major railway corridors, supplying German forces across the Eastern Front. Production had increased to approximately 50 winter-grade Shims per week, deployed by 5 separate installation teams operating in different sectors. The cumulative effect on German logistics became increasingly apparent. Transport schedules showed delays averaging 6 days for priority shipments. Non-essential transports were frequently cancelled entirely, with their resources reallocated to maintaining the priority schedules. "We're creating a multiplication effect," Johnson explained to Colonel Volkov during their monthly strategy review. "Every resource they divert to railway repairs is unavailable for other purposes. Every delayed shipment creates cascading disruptions throughout their supply chain, and most importantly, every derailment reinforces their incorrect assumption about the cause." The psychological impact extended to the German troops as well. Intercepted communications revealed growing frustration among unit commanders waiting for critical supplies. Maintenance units struggled with equipment shortages. Fuel rationing became more severe as reserves dwindled due to transport difficulties. "We're not just derailing trains," Volkov observed. "We're derailing their entire logistical mindset." As February arrived, bringing even colder temperatures to the Russian forests, the Johnson-Shim operation entered a new phase. Soviet forces had begun a major offensive along the northern sectors, pushing German units back toward the west. This changing front line created both opportunities and challenges for the partisan operations. "We need to adapt our deployment strategy," Johnson told the command staff during the February planning session. "As Soviet forces advance, our operational areas will shift. We need to focus on the railways that support the German retreat and redeployment efforts." This strategic pivot required new intelligence on German transport patterns. Lieutenant Petrova expanded her information network, recruiting additional sources among the local population in recently liberated areas. These new informants provided critical details about German railway operations under pressure. "They're consolidating their transport corridors," Petrova reported on February 12th. "Instead of using multiple rail lines, they're focusing their security and maintenance resources on 3 primary routes. These lines are now handling approximately 80% of their total transport volume." This concentration created an ideal scenario for the Johnson-Shim operation. With German transports channeled through fewer routes, each successful derailment would have a proportionally greater impact on their overall logistics. The Partisan Command developed a new deployment plan codenamed Operation Bottleneck. Rather than spreading their resources across multiple railway lines, they would concentrate on the 3 primary corridors Petrova had identified. Each corridor would be targeted with precisely placed shims at locations selected to maximize disruption. "We need to think beyond individual derailments," Johnson explained as he outlined the operation. "Our goal now is to create systematic uncertainty within their transport network. We want their command elements to lose confidence in the entire system." The first phase of Operation Bottleneck began on February 18th, with installation teams deploying winter-grade shims along all 3 primary corridors within a 48-hour window. The timing was coordinated to ensure that derailments would occur in different sectors on consecutive days. The results unfolded exactly as planned. On February 20th, a German ammunition transport derailed near Gomel. On February 21st, a fuel transport derailed west of Bryansk, and on February 22nd, an armored vehicle transport derailed south of Smolensk. These consecutive disruptions created exactly the psychological impact Johnson had anticipated. German command records, later captured by advancing Soviet forces, revealed a critical communication from the Eastern Front Transportation Office to Berlin headquarters. Systematic transport failure across multiple sectors suggests coordinated material deficiencies in railway infrastructure. Recommend immediate engineering assessment of all Eastern Territory rail systems. Current failure rate indicates potential collapse of entire network without substantial reinforcement. This assessment represented a significant victory for the partisan operation. The Germans had begun to question the fundamental integrity of their transportation infrastructure, exactly as Johnson had predicted. "They're now facing an impossible dilemma," he explained to Colonel Volkov after reviewing the intercepted communication. "They can either reduce transport volume to minimize stress on the system, effectively cutting their own supply lines, or they can continue at current capacity and face increasing failures." The German command, under pressure to maintain frontline supplies while simultaneously supporting tactical retreats, chose the latter option. They continued using the railways at maximum capacity while attempting to reinforce the infrastructure. This decision played directly into the Partisan strategy. Throughout late February and early March, installation teams continued deploying Johnson shims along the primary transport corridors. Each successful derailment reinforced the German belief in systemic infrastructure failure. By mid-March, the cumulative impact had become severe. German transport capacity had declined by an estimated 45%. Critical supplies, fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment arrived at frontline units weeks behind schedule. Maintenance backlogs grew as parts and tools remained stuck in the disrupted supply chain. On March 22nd, a significant development occurred when a Soviet reconnaissance unit recovered documents from a captured German engineering corps headquarters. Among the papers was a comprehensive assessment of the railway failures affecting the Eastern Front. The report, prepared by senior German transportation engineers, concluded, "The pattern of failures strongly indicates systemic metal fatigue exacerbated by extreme temperature fluctuations. Microscopic examination of failed rail sections shows stress fractures consistent with thermal expansion and contraction. No evidence of sabotage or intentional damage has been identified." When this document reached the Partisan headquarters, Johnson read it with a mixture of professional satisfaction and quiet amusement. "They've conducted a thorough scientific investigation and reached exactly the wrong conclusion," he told Colonel Volkov. "Their own engineering expertise has become their blind spot." Indeed, the German response to their incorrect analysis further compounded the problem. They initiated a massive program to replace standard rail connections with reinforced, cold-resistant versions. This effort diverted thousands of tons of specialized steel from other military applications, consumed countless labor hours, and still failed to address the actual cause of the derailments. As spring approached, bringing milder temperatures to the Russian forests, Samuel Johnson faced a new challenge. The winter-grade shims had been designed specifically for cold weather conditions. As temperatures rose, their effectiveness would diminish. "We need to adapt again," Johnson informed the production teams in late March. "The spring thaw will change the thermal properties of the rails. Our shims must evolve accordingly." The transition to spring-grade shims involved more than just adjusting thickness. Johnson completely redesigned the internal structure, creating a composite device that combined rigid and flexible elements. The new shims would respond differently to the warmer conditions while maintaining their disruptive capability. "The revised design is actually more sophisticated," Johnson noted in his technical journal. "Rather than relying primarily on thermal contraction, these spring variants exploit the increased flexibility of warm metal. The design creates a progressive failure that mimics natural wear patterns even more convincingly." The manufacturing process became more complex as well. Pavel Orlov developed a layered approach, combining different metal types salvaged from various German vehicles. The outer layers used softer steel from transport trucks, while the inner core continued to use the high-carbon armor plate from disabled tanks. "Each layer serves a specific purpose," Orlov explained to the production teams. "The outer layers deform gradually under pressure, while the inner core maintains structural integrity until the critical moment. The combined effect is a more natural-seeming failure progression. By early April, the transition to spring-grade shims was complete. Installation teams received the new devices, along with revised placement guidelines that accounted for the changing seasonal conditions. The effectiveness of these new shims was demonstrated on April 12th, when a German transport carrying replacement parts for aircraft derailed near the Dnieper River crossing. German investigation teams spent 4 days examining the derailment site, ultimately concluding that seasonal ground shift following the spring thaw caused railbed subsidence, leading to connection failure. This conclusion highlighted once again the success of Johnson's approach. By designing devices that created failures consistent with natural environmental conditions, he ensured that German investigators would continue looking in the wrong direction. As April progressed, the strategic landscape of the Eastern Front continued to evolve. Soviet forces maintained their westward advance, pushing German units back toward their pre-invasion positions. This changing front line altered the partisan operational environment, creating both new opportunities and challenges. "Our area of operations is shifting," Colonel Volkov informed the command staff during the April strategy meeting. As Soviet forces advance, German transport patterns are adapting. They're establishing new supply lines further west while abandoning their eastern railway networks. This development required a significant adjustment to the Johnson-Shim deployment strategy. Lieutenant Petrova's intelligence network identified 3 new transport corridors that had become critical to German logistics as they reorganized their defensive positions. "These new routes are receiving less maintenance attention," Petrova reported. "The Germans are focusing their engineering resources on frontline fortifications rather than transport infrastructure. This creates additional vulnerabilities we can exploit." Johnson and his team developed specialized variants of the spring-grade shim designed specifically for these neglected railway sections. The new devices, dubbed neglect exploiters by the manufacturing team, were calibrated to take advantage of the already deteriorating conditions of these secondary lines. "These railways haven't received proper maintenance in months," Johnson explained as he presented the new designs. "The connection plates are already showing signs of wear. Our shims are designed to accelerate and focus that natural deterioration process." The first deployment of these specialized shims occurred on April 28th along a secondary line running northwest from Kiev. The target was a German transport carrying replacement parts and ammunition to units defending the approaches to Poland. The operation succeeded beyond expectations. According to observer reports, the derailment affected 17 railcars, completely blocking the line at a point where alternative routing was impossible due to terrain constraints. German response teams, already stretched thin by competing demands, took 11 days to clear the line and restore service. During this period, the affected units received no resupply, significantly reducing their combat effectiveness as Soviet forces approached their positions. Throughout May, similar operations continued along the identified transport corridors. Each successful derailment further degraded German logistical capabilities during a period when they desperately needed to reposition forces and supplies. By late May, Samuel Johnson's contribution to the partisan resistance had evolved from a tactical innovation to a strategic asset. The cumulative impact of the Johnson-Shim operations had fundamentally altered the logistics equation on the Eastern Front, creating what military analysts would later describe as a multiplication of disadvantages for German forces. The significance of this contribution was recognized on June 3rd, when a special courier arrived at the partisan camp with a message from Soviet High Command. Colonel Volkov assembled the senior staff to hear the communication. "Engineer Samuel Johnson," Volkov read from the official document, "your technical innovation has been recognized at the highest levels of Allied command. The disruption to enemy logistics has substantially contributed to recent Soviet advances. Your methodology is being adapted for resistance operations throughout occupied territories." The document continued with a formal request for Johnson to travel to Moscow to brief senior Soviet and Allied technical officers on his designs and methods. This recognition represented not just an acknowledgement of his contribution, but an opportunity to expand its impact across multiple fronts. Johnson received the news with characteristic modesty. "The success belongs to everyone involved," he told the assembled staff. "The manufacturing teams who worked with minimal resources, the installation teams who risked their lives, the intelligence network that identified targets. I simply provided a technical solution. You all made it operational." In the days that followed, Johnson prepared comprehensive documentation of the entire Shim program, design specifications, manufacturing methods, installation techniques, and target selection criteria. This information would allow the operation to continue and expand even after his departure. On June 10th, as Samuel Johnson prepared to leave the Bryansk forest, Colonel Volkov organized a final briefing session to review the impact of the operation. According to our latest intelligence, Volkov announced, the Johnson Shim has been responsible for 40 confirmed transport disruptions between August 1943 and June 1944. The cumulative effect on German logistics has been assessed as equivalent to the loss of approximately 650 rail cars of critical supplies. These numbers, impressive as they were, captured only the direct impact. The indirect effects, delayed shipments, diverted resources, reduced confidence, had multiplied the operational value many times over. Perhaps the most significant achievement, Lieutenant Petrova added, is that after 10 months of operation, the Germans still have not identified the actual cause. Their engineering teams continue to focus on environmental and material factors rather than resistance activity. This ongoing misdirection represented the most elegant aspect of Johnson's approach. By working with natural forces rather than against them, he had created a form of resistance that remained invisible, even as its effects became increasingly apparent. On his final evening in the Partisan camp, Samuel Johnson sat with his colleagues around the communal fire. The conversation turned reflective as they considered the journey they had shared. "When I arrived in Russia," Johnson told them, "I understood engineering principles but knew nothing about partisan warfare. You taught me how technical knowledge must be adapted to real-world conditions and human factors." Nikolai Zollner, who had been with the operation since the first installation, nodded thoughtfully. "And you taught us that resistance isn't always about dramatic actions. Sometimes the smallest intervention, if placed precisely, can have the greatest impact." Pavel Orlov raised his cup in a toast. "To the power of the small," and he said, "properly applied." The following morning, Samuel Johnson departed the Bryansk forest, carrying with him the technical documentation that would allow his innovation to spread throughout the resistance networks of occupied Europe. The Johnson Shim would soon be deployed on railways in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, continuing to disrupt German logistics across multiple fronts. The Partisan unit in the Bryansk forest continued their operations, expanding and refining Johnson's methods. By the time Soviet forces fully liberated the region in late 1944, the unit had conducted 57 successful Shim operations, disrupting German transport capacity throughout the critical months of the Soviet advance. After the war, Samuel Johnson returned to Detroit, resuming his work in automotive engineering. The specialized knowledge he had gained during his partisan service led to innovations in suspension systems and stress management for high-performance vehicles. His wartime experiences remained classified for decades, preventing public recognition of his contribution. It wasn't until 1972 that the full story of the Johnson Shim became public, following the declassification of certain OSS operations. Military historians were astonished to discover that one of the most effective resistance techniques of the war had been developed not by professional saboteurs, but by an automotive engineer applying basic principles in innovative ways. In 1974, Samuel Johnson was finally awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his contribution to the Allied war effort. The citation noted that his innovation had demonstrated how technical ingenuity, properly applied, could achieve strategic impact with minimal resources and risk. Today, a small monument stands in the Bryansk forest where Johnson and the Partisan unit once operated. The inscription in both Russian and English reads, "Here, in the darkest days of war, allies from different nations combined their knowledge to prove that ingenuity can overcome overwhelming force. Their weapon was not destruction, but disruption, not confrontation, but calculated intervention." The legacy of the Johnson Shim extends beyond its historical impact. It represents an enduring lesson in asymmetric response, how understanding fundamental principles can reveal leverage points where seemingly insignificant actions can produce disproportionate results. In military academies around the world, the case study of the Johnson Shim is still taught as an example of how technical innovation can transform resistance operations. Engineers study it as a model of elegant design under severe resource constraints, and historians cite it as evidence of how diverse knowledge and perspectives can combine to create solutions that no single tradition could have developed alone. Perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Samuel Johnson himself, who, when asked about his wartime innovation in a 1982 interview, replied with characteristic simplicity, "Engineering is about understanding how systems work. Once you truly understand a system, you can change its behavior with surprisingly small interventions. The key is knowing exactly where and how to apply the pressure." The story of how a black American engineer working with Russian partisans developed a simple device that confounded German logistics represents more than just a fascinating historical footnote. It illustrates a timeless principle, that in the face of seemingly overwhelming force, human ingenuity, properly applied, can find the small point of leverage where the impossible becomes possible. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.